Earlier this year in Switzerland, we celebrated the great transit of the Earls and their heroic crossing of the Alps. Now, the story of the Ulster Earls is very well known to all of us. And I think one of the most important points about it is that it was part of an historic seismic movement in the Irish national experience. What I sometimes call as our fall of Constantinople, when the tectonic plates of Irish tradition and experience moved massively and irreversibly. But the flight of the Earls signified not just the end of the old Gaelic order, but also the beginning of a new and more intense and highly visible stage of connection with Europe. And I wanted to convey some of that momentous background to the Swiss. And the problem was how to do it. Well, one element of intrinsic appeal I should explain in the flight of the Earls was the story of O'Neill's goal. On St. Patrick's Day, 1608, the great Hugh O'Neill, at a place called the Devil's Bridge, high up on the edge of the St. Gothard, lost a fortune in gold. And try as he would, he brought back the horse. The Irish love horses, but he couldn't bring back the gold. So I used to joke to the Swiss that it was only a coincidence that in the years afterwards, Zurich became one of the great financial centres of Europe. And in fact, I hear there are Swiss bankers still up there today, hoping to find the money. But without stretching history to the point of absurdity, I wanted also to avail of this major moment in Irish history to spotlight a longer background of Ireland's deeply rooted connections with Switzerland and with Europe. And here I was inspired by the magnificent diary of Taigh O'Keenan, which you can see here, and that's the section which deals with the passage of the arts, beautiful in its calligraphy and the elegance of its style, beautiful also in its keen eye for detail and description. And like the contemporary or near-contemporary annals of the Four Masters, which is also here, a number of important pages, including the departure from the Swilly, the death of Hugh O'Neill, and the famous signature page of the Four Masters book. All of this marked a stage of transition and loss and passage in Irish history. But it was also a phase which drew great power and energy and force and confidence from the long Irish manuscript tradition. And so what I offered the Swiss, and this is what's represented here for all practical purposes, as a sub-theme was the notion of the antiquity and longevity of the Irish manuscript material. I should quote something before I move on, if my glasses are here somewhere, which is what O'Keenan wrote about Switzerland before he moved on to Rome and on to Milan, which then was a Spanish town, and on to Rome. He said they had traversed 46 leagues of the country of the Swiss, and it was strong, well fortified, uneven, mountainous, extensive, having bad roads, and no supremacy, rule, or claim to submission by any king or prince in the world over the inhabitants. In themselves, they form a strange, remarkable, peculiar state. They make their selection of a system for the government of the country each year. They have 14 important cities. Half of them are Catholics, and the other half are Protestants. And by agreement and great oaths, they are bound to one another for their defence and protection against any neighbour in the world who would endeavour to injure or oppose them. They are just, honest, untreacherous, and because of their perfect honour, they alone are the guards of the kings of Christendom. Now, of course, this was intended to make the Swiss blush, and blush they should have done at such unstinted praise. But I think from our point of view, it's a quite remarkable text because it is the encounter of an Irish Gaelic Catholic refugee fleeing from the turbulence, the division, the conflict of the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation in Ireland with a regularized, institutionalized, agreed system of toleration between Catholics and Protestants in the early 17th century. It's also interesting from another point of view, even more remarkable in some ways, that it's the first encounter between the Gaelic aristocratic imagination and a republican form of government. And it wasn't until another 150 years, really, under pressure of the French and the American Revolution, that some of the nostalgia, the royalist nostalgia of the continental Irish and of the rural Irish was shaken and reshaped into a republican tradition. And there was no better place, I would say, than Switzerland, apart, of course, from this great northwest corner, St. Colum's College, and also Donegal, in which to offer a manuscript exhibition on the longevity and the antiquity of the Irish tradition, because Switzerland is one of the most important points of contact and the whole Rhine Valley region between early Ireland and early Europe. And Switzerland is the largest repository of early Irish manuscripts outside of Ireland. And in the monastery of St. Gallen, there you have the largest single collection of early Irish manuscripts in any institution in the world. And it was in this library and through the pioneering work of a German scholar, Johann Caspar Zeuss, that in the 19th century the study of Old Irish began, and the first Old Irish grammar, Grammatica Celtica, was published in 1953. Some of the very rare books on display, the most famous is the Christian, you can see it, a Latin codex, famous for its marginalia, for its microscopic marginalia within marginalia, for some of the most beautiful poems in Irish, in Old Irish. You know the famous poem, the Blackbird of Belfast Loch, or the Blackbird of Loch Nee, the yellow-nibbed blackbird sings his note. That famous poem, The Scribe Out of Doors, a wall of woodland surrounds me, and one of the most quoted poems in the Irish tradition, the poem about the Vikings. You can see them all in these 3 pages, in the marginalia, not in the Latin text. The wind blows hard tonight, tossing the tresses of the waves to white. On winter's nights like these, I ride at ease. Fierce Norsemen cannot cross the Irish seas. All of you know that poem, but no translation can ever match the condensed, implosive brevity of the piece, the 7 or 8 words that are right there on the top page of that manuscript. There's also an example of Ogham, and I hope I will be forgiven for saying this. It's a late example of Ogham, but it's allegedly written by a monk who had a hangover. In those days, when ink was short supply, a heavy version of wine was used as a substitute, and the next day in high dudgeon, the monk saw that his glosses had faded out the night before, mysteriously, so he decided to do his gloss in Ogham. And of course, one very important series represented here, from a Derry and Donegal point of view, and this has certainly never been seen in Ireland before, is the oldest manuscript life of Columkill by Eunan. The dating is about 700. St. Eunan was still alive as Abbot of Iona. This was either dictated by him or is the first draft of the manuscript written on the basis of his draft. It's in 4 books, including, of course, the first telling of the great story of the Loch Ness Monster. And it includes also in one, you'll see the last page there, the signature of the scribe, quite rare. His name was de Benning. How and why these precious manuscripts reached their current locations in Europe is a fascinating tale, but for another day. They are to be found not alone along the Rhine Valley, but throughout France, Germany, Britain, Italy and Austria, in over 20 different European locations. Both their presence and their dispersal are eloquent reminders of the remarkable and extensive Irish monastic and educational engagement in medieval Europe, a role which flowered under the Carolingians. We know Sedulius Scottus and Eugenia, so many names, we could go on and on. A role which persisted despite, even perhaps because of, the Viking incursions, and less well known, a role which underwent a remarkable recovery in the 12th century. And really, you could say that direct Irish monastic involvement with Europe did not finally end until the early 15th century, when the last Irish abbot of the Vienna Schottenstift, the Blessed Thomas, died in 1418. And it was through that famous Irish monastery in Vienna that the University of Vienna and the University of Prague owe some of their early origins and some of their early reputation. All of this lore, the golden age of saints and scholars, and the later high deeds and valour of the wild geese, was for me, and I think other people in my generation, part of our imaginative formation. And I think that it helps to explain the 83% vote that we got in the first referendum in Ireland in 1972. That referendum, I always feel, was a sort of jubilant cry of liberation, a moment when we recognized that we were re-engaging with Europe. It was not a first-time engagement. This was a reconnection of an old and noble and proud heritage. No vote on that euphoric scale, or even close to it, was ever reached again in Europe until 2003, when, for reasons that are obvious, Slovakia, Slovenia and Hungary voted yes in the high 80s, with an approval vote in Lithuania of over 90%. I used to say that the Irish vote could never be surpassed. Well, there you go. And in Poland and the Czech Republic, where some people talk about moderate Euroscepticism, the vote was over 77%. Far and away above that of Finland, Austria and Sweden 10 years before, and of Denmark in 1972. And I see all of this also as with the Irish referendum in 1972 as an irrepressible affirmation of independence from the past, and the declaration by these Central European states of full confidence in a common European future. In Switzerland, the high point of our inauguration, commemoration of the Flight of the Earls, was the opening, unveiling of a special, very beautiful serpentine green cut stone, in which is written, "Here passed the last princes of Ireland," a bridge between Ireland and Europe. The stone, by the way, stands outside the old medieval church in Andermatt, high in the Alps. And that church is dedicated, believe it or not, to St. Columbanus. And it may well have been that Hugh O'Neill and Rory O'Donnell had always sheltered in that church. O'Keenan makes no reference to the church, and indeed I may be one of the first people to discover that its real name was not St. Patrick's Church, as some historians thought, but that of St. Columbanus. And there's a lovely little statue of Columbanus there. Afterwards, I brought back to it two members of the O'Neill clan, two very distinguished members. One was Rosemary O'Neill, who was the daughter of Tip O'Neill, Speaker of the House, who together with Ted Kennedy and John Hume inaugurated in 1981 an organisation with which I worked when I was in Washington, an organisation called the Friends of Ireland, which really laid the basis for the decisive Clinton engagement in Ireland about 8 years ago. As we know, the British were extremely apprehensive about an American involvement in Irish affairs, in Northern Irish affairs. And it was only because of the clear and constant commitment of the congressional friends to a doctrine of nonviolence and to the whole notion of peace and reconciliation and agreement in Ireland that the decisive, history-changing American role was delivered. The other O'Neill was Gabrielle O'Neill du Tiron from the Asturias in Spain, and she was a direct descendant of Owen Roe O'Neill and Rosa O'Doherty. It was an uncle of Owen Roe, Henry O'Neill, who formed the first consolidated, so-named Hibernian regiment in the Spanish army. That was the precursor for many, many Irish regiments, not alone in Spain, but throughout Europe, the so-called Irish Continental Brigades. And there, under the spire, I hope this is not too maudlin and sentimental, but there, on that day, a lovely Sunday afternoon, under the spire and in the shadow of St. Columban's Church, by the monument dedicated to the flight of the Earls, I thought that for one brief, fleeting moment that we had united the three disparate strands of the Irish diaspora, the monastic, the wild geese, and the Irish American. And we all felt something special from that particular encounter. In this school, in this place, we don't have to say too much about the wild geese. We have not, as Irish people, discovered them simply from our history books. They are ingrained in our imagination, and so ingrained are they that they form part of our folklore and of our folk songs, and we experience them also in the Aisling poetry of Gaelic Munster, where poets like Aigan O'Rahilly held on together with his continental cousins to what I call the magnificent folly of an impossible Stuart resurgence. And that was a dominant political, even ideological drive in 18th century and in early 18th century Europe for the Irish. If I might quote from a Unionist Irish historian, W.E.H. Leckie, a loyal Victorian but a good friend of Ireland, those of us who studied history under Jack Gallagher will remember the 3-volume history. But he sought to defend Ireland against our detractors, particularly the contrary and very contrary historian Freud. But writing of the 18th century Irish overseas, he said, "Abroad, there is hardly a country where Irish exiles or their children might not be found in posts of dignity and power. Lord Clare became Marshal of France. Brown was one of the very ablest Austrian generals. Maguire, Lacy, Nugent and O'Donnell were all prominent generals in the Austrian service. Another Brown was Field Marshal in the Russian service and Governor of Riga." The historian Leckie continues, "Tyrconnell was French ambassador at the court of Berlin. Wall, before he became Prime Minister of Spain, represented that country at the court of London. Lacy was Spanish ambassador in Stockholm and O'Mahony in Vienna." So that's a nice roll call by Leckie of eminent 18th century Irish diplomatists. And I have written down here that with such illustrious predecessors, I feel particularly distinguished to be Ireland's first ambassador, born in the famous road named in honour of this Victorian historian, Derry's Leckie Road. But curiously, it was a Sheehan of the Wild Geese, a descendant of the McCartans, one of 2 presidents of France of Irish descent, a friend and defender of Ireland in 1945 and 46, whose sceptical view of British membership ensured that Irish membership of the EU was delayed until 1973. By this I mean, of course, the great General de Gaulle, who twice refused Britain's application, in 1962 and again in 1967. Although in August 1961, the Irish were very careful to get our application in 10 days before the British. We didn't want to follow after them. Such was our economic interconnection, even dependence on the British in those days, that we had to wait almost a decade before de Gaulle was replaced by Pompidou in 1968 and took a prolonged holiday with his ancestors in the south of Kerry before definitive negotiations with Ireland and others began. But I remember in Bishop Street in Jack Gallagher's class, which was out in the back behind the junior study, that's where I saw my first European poster. The year must have been 1961 or 62. It must have been part of the nascent emerging EEC campaign at the time, and there was a map of the wall, two big superpowers, the Russians in red and the Americans in red, white and blue, and a fragmented Europe in the middle, and the slogan was, "Why not a single Europe?" And why not indeed? And I remember also myself and a number of others in that A-level class, which could reach, it sounds a bit grandiose, but was capable of reaching a fairly serious level of debate, but a debate about the paradox between Europe of civilization and the Europe of conflict. Our history books ended in those days in 1945. So the dominant notion was one of intense European conflict. Forget about the peace of Netherlands. And how did that square with the notion of a Europe of civilization? And I have to say that it was around that time that I became, again, I hope this is not too pretentious, but something of a Europeanist. And when I went to UCD, where the role of Ireland at the UN was more visible, Frank Aiken, and where the role of Ireland at the Council of Europe was more visible, Sean McBride, a number of us began to think that yes, small countries could play a role in Europe, and that what had to be created was an institutional Europe. We had to replace the Europe of conflict with the Europe of institutions, where great power rivalry would be sublimated and channeled and redirected into the search for a common European engagement, a single European enterprise, and where small countries could play a soothing role. And I think progressively that really has been what has emerged. And we have a very distinguished representative of the Commission with us here. I won't ask him to comment, but you know, lots of people were scared of what they call the federal Europe. But the essence of the thing is that the culture of Brussels is really a culture of caution, of compromise, of care, and that is a culture which sits well with small countries like Ireland. And our room for comfort and our room for manoeuvre was assisted in the 90s as the talk of a federal Europe began to recede, as neutral countries such as Sweden and Austria and Finland joined the EU, and then more recently, as we found friends among the new countries to emerge from post-Soviet Europe. And this European institution is an extraordinary thing. I mean, the institutional Europe we have created in Brussels, a permanent bureaucracy, a bureaucracy of politicians and civil servants, which for 300 days, sometimes 24 hours a day, negotiates in extraordinary, painstaking detail, sometimes about very trivial matters, housekeeping matters, relevant to the European Union, but often about great matters of world affairs, about the creation of prosperity, the alleviation of poverty, the defense of human rights, about curbing climate change, about securing energy supply, about creating peace and stability in our own neighbourhood. And most of this negotiation happens below the radar screen. It's a way in which all of that energy of the great powers and the soothing role of the smaller powers go together to create that spirit of compromise. It isn't the highest expression of European literary civilization. That's maybe the paradox, and sometimes we talk about the disconnect between the people and the bureaucrats. But what it loses in terms of visibility and clarity of expression and elegance of prose, it gives back, in my view, tenfold in the cultivation of a sense of common purpose, of commonality, of the rallying of 27 countries behind a view of Europe which is humane and generous and redistributive, active in the world, active in a moderated and in a humane way. And the Lisbon Treaty was designed to secure and even streamline that European role and make it more efficient and more engaged, domestically in Europe and internationally beyond Europe's shores. What about Europe, Ireland, and so on? Has the European Union been good for Ireland? Well, the first and most visible beneficial consequence, and the answer is yes, was the modernisation of Irish agriculture. A second consequence, slower to emerge, was the diversification of Irish exports. In 1972, 65% of our exports went to Britain. And 30 years later, 75% of our exports go to other parts of the world. In terms of the Anglo-Irish relationship, if I could quote something that Bertie Ahern said in 2003 in Prague, our relationship with the United Kingdom has changed beyond recognition. It is now one of genuine partnership in our mutual search for reconciliation on the island of Ireland. I am convinced that the space the European Union provided was critical in allowing that mature relationship to develop. As someone who regards himself part of what I call the 5th of October generation, I sometimes wonder what that relationship would have been like over the last 40 years if by some historical happenstance or great surge of isolationism, Ireland had stayed outside of the EU and Britain had gone on to enter. We know something of the history of the 80s, of the aftershock of the first oil crisis, of well-intentioned government spending, sometimes competitive spending. But when I went to Australia as ambassador in 1987, the Economist magazine, which you all know, liberal, neoliberal, moderately Eurosceptic, but very influential, had a great big front page of a poor travelling woman bathing with a bowl at O'Connell Bridge, and the headline was, "Ireland, the poorest of the rich." So you can imagine that I spent a certain amount of time in Australia and Japan trying to recover from the impact of that particular image. But 10 years later, when I went to Denmark, and I have it here, The Economist, by way of retribution, had another front page. Europe, Ireland, Europe's shining light. And everybody wanted to know what happened. And in the meantime, what had happened was that there had been an extraordinary growth of prosperity, an accumulation of wealth, a reduction of debt, a diversification of industrial production,